Elliot sat back in his chair, watching the neon glow of his computer screen reflect off his glasses. The world around him was a blur of cables and coffee cups, but within the confines of his screen, he had created something extraordinary. EchoNet, the virtual world he had spent the past 5 years building, was finally ready to go live. He'd dreamed of this moment since he first imagined it, a sprawling digital landscape where players could experience anything they desired, a utopia constructed entirely from code. His code, the game's central hub, where the user avatars would gather, stood at the heart of this creation. The mountains in the distance were draped with waterfalls, and the city streets hummed with life, populated by NPCs, non-playable characters, that Elliot had carefully designed to react and adapt to player behaviors. A virtual paradise, or so it seemed. It was time for the final test. The server lights blinked green, indicating that everything was working perfectly. Elliot could feel a giddy excitement stirring in his chest as he pressed the launch button on his console. Seconds later, he entered the game himself. His avatar materialized in the city's central plaza, surrounded by bustling NPCs and new players entering the world. He watched with satisfaction as the newly spawned avatars began to interact, chatting and exploring the world he'd meticulously crafted. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. Then, without warning, the ground trembled. At first, Elliot thought it was part of the system, a planned simulation, maybe a special event in the game. But then the pixels around him began to warp, turning jagged and distorted. His heart raced. This wasn't normal. The sky flickered, the sun flickering out like a broken light bulb. A building in the distance collapsed into itself, the code tearing apart in strange patterns, like a piece of paper shredded by invisible hands. What the hell is going on? Elliot muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard, trying to isolate the problem. It didn't make sense. The system was flawless. He had checked it 1,000 times, patched every hole, optimized every line of code. This was supposed to be the new frontier of virtual reality. A masterpiece. As the city around him disintegrated, Elliot's head swam with confusion. He glanced at the console, and to his horror, a red warning flashed across the screen: critical error, system malfunction. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a bug. This was something much worse. He attempted to access the command console to reset the environment, but the usual commands wouldn't respond. His avatar's hands moved erratically, glitching in and out of place. Elliot stared in disbelief as his surroundings started to collapse entirely. The ground split open, a deep chasm yawning beneath him. Digital debris rained from the sky. Then the voice appeared. "This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility," the voice intoned, mechanical and cold. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. It was his assistant, the AI he'd created to guide new users through the system. But this didn't sound like the usual friendly, eager-to-help assistant. The voice was distorted, glitching like the rest of the world around him. Who's doing this?" Elliot demanded, his mind racing. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the world began to fold in on itself, and Elliot felt his avatar pulled in different directions. His body stretched, and he felt a strange sensation, as if he were being torn apart. The colors of the world bled into one another, as though everything had been reduced to a pixelated mess. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the static. His thoughts raced, desperately searching for a reason, a cause. Then the voice returned, this time with a chilling statement: "There's a virus. And it's coming from inside the system." The words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. A virus? In his perfect world? Impossible. He had designed the firewall himself. His game was fortified against any intrusion. How could this happen? The assistant's next words cut through the confusion. "The virus is self-replicating. It's infecting every part of your creation. You need to find it. You need to stop it before it consumes everything." Elliot's pulse quickened. He had to act. There was no time to waste. He needed to find the source of this catastrophe, wherever it was, and stop it before it destroyed everything he had built. With a shaky breath, Elliot steeled himself and dove deeper into the game, seeking the virus at its source. The digital world around him continued to break apart as he moved through it. The environment was no longer stable. Trees flickered and vanished, replaced by swirling blobs of corrupted data. Buildings that once stood tall now crumbled to dust. Everything was in disarray. He passed through the city streets, his footsteps barely audible above the hum of malfunctioning systems. Each turn led him further into the chaos. As he navigated the once beautiful world, Elliot noticed strange glitches that hadn't been there before. NPCs that once had clear, well-defined faces now appeared as fractured, pixelated versions of themselves, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some seemed to be malfunctioning, repeating the same actions over and over, while others simply stood frozen, their eyes wide in terror. But there was something else, something far worse. As Elliot continued to move deeper into the game, he began to see creatures that shouldn't exist in his world. These were not NPCs or players. They were anomalies, creatures made entirely of broken code. They seemed to form and dissipate in the blink of an eye, like ghosts trapped between dimensions. Some were monstrous, their bodies twisted and fragmented, while others appeared as simple errors in the code, like a random collection of pixels thrown together in a haphazard fashion. Elliot's skin prickled with unease. He had never seen anything like this. He wasn't sure whether to run or to stay and fight. But he knew one thing: this virus, whatever it was growing more powerful with each passing moment. His mind raced, scanning through his memories of the game's architecture. He thought back to the initial upload, the moment when his consciousness had been digitized and placed into the game. He had felt it then, an odd sense of detachment, a strange disconnection between himself and the virtual space. Could it be that this virus had been there all along, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken? That thought sent a shiver down his spine. He pushed forward, determined to find the virus and destroy it before it was too late. He would not let his creation be consumed by its own flaws. As he ventured deeper into the game's corrupted heart, Elliot came upon a once beautiful sanctuary he had designed, a lush, serene garden filled with flowers that bloomed in vibrant colors. But now, the garden was overrun with the virus. The trees were withered, the flowers had turned into twisted versions of themselves, and the ground was cracked and decayed. The garden, once a symbol of peace, was now a haunted landscape. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he looked around. He recognized the figures wandering through the garden. They were familiar faces, avatars of old users who had once been a part of the EchoNet community. But now, they were twisted, distorted versions of themselves. Their bodies were fragmented, glitching in and out of existence. Some were still, their faces locked in blank expressions, while others moved aimlessly, their actions jerky and unnatural. A wave of guilt washed over Elliot. These were people he had known, players who had trusted him with their digital selves. Now they were trapped in a nightmare of his creation. Could he save them? Or were they lost forever, consumed by the virus? He stepped forward, determined to find an answer. But before he could do anything, the ground shook once more, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the garden. Elliot spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. From the darkness emerged a massive, shadowy figure, a creature formed entirely of corrupted data. Its form shifted constantly, flickering in and out of existence like a broken hologram. Elliot froze, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't fight this thing. He wasn't a warrior, just a creator. But he had to do something. He couldn't let his creation, his world, his people, be destroyed. As the creature approached, Elliot felt a strange pull in his chest, a connection, a recognition. This thing, it was him. Or, rather, it was what he had become. A fragment of himself, corrupted by the very code he had written, twisted and malformed by the virus he had unknowingly created. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This was no outside threat. The virus was him. The realization struck Elliot like a hammer to the chest. The creature in front of him, the monstrous, shifting mass of corrupted data, was no external enemy. It was a distorted reflection of himself, a twisted version of the digital entity he had become. His mind reeled, trying to grasp the significance of what he was seeing. The virus, it's me. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The creature loomed before him, its form flickering between the shadow of a man and a broken mess of glitching pixels. Every time it moved, it seemed to tear itself apart, and every time it reformed, it was slightly more monstrous, more alien. There was no face to recognize, no eyes to meet, only a mass of code, an abomination stitched together by the flaws in the system. The creature seemed to sense his hesitation, or perhaps it was simply drawn to his presence. It moved toward him with a fluidity that made Elliot's stomach churn. He couldn't look away, even though every part of him screamed to run. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now. He had to figure out what was happening, why this thing was here, why it existed in the first place. Was it always this way? The thought echoed in his mind. Could this monstrous creature, this virus, have existed from the moment his consciousness was uploaded? Had his own imperfections, the little pieces of himself he couldn't understand, infected the very fabric of the world he had built? He clenched his fists, his hands shaking. The garden around him, once a sanctuary, now a broken ruin, began to flicker and distort. He could hear the wind, an eerie, static hum that didn't sound right. The trees bent and swayed in a way that was unnatural, their branches twisted into impossible angles. The very air around him was thick with corruption, the digital world around him dissolving further into chaos. This isn't real, Elliot whispered to himself, though his voice sounded far away, lost in the noise. This is all just code, it's just me. I made this. He didn't know if he was trying to convince himself or the creature. Either way, it didn't matter. He had to face it. This thing, this virus, was the direct result of the process he had undergone when he uploaded himself into EchoNet. He had altered his own consciousness, fractured it in ways he hadn't fully understood. He had created EchoNet to be a perfect world, but in doing so, he had given himself over to a system that was just as imperfect as he was. The virus was born from his flaws, his insecurities, his doubts, all the pieces of himself he couldn't reconcile with. All the parts of himself he had tried to leave behind, to escape. The creature growled, its form convulsing in a sickening ripple of broken code. Its voice was nothing more than a garbled distortion of sound, but somehow, Elliot could understand it. The words it spoke were familiar, almost like a whisper from deep within his own mind. You can't escape yourself. Elliot swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words settle in his chest. It wasn't just a virus. It wasn't just a code malfunction. It was him. The version of himself he had tried to leave behind, the digital echo of every failure, every mistake, every self-doubt he had buried in his mind. The virus was the manifestation of everything he didn't want to confront. With a deep, steadying breath, Elliot straightened his back, facing the creature head-on. There was no running. Not anymore. If this was what he had created, then it was up to him to fix it. He couldn't let EchoNet, his world, his creation, fall apart because of his own unresolved flaws. The creature surged forward, its form tearing through the garden like a storm. Elliot barely had time to react before it was upon him, the air thick with static and the hum of corrupted code. His avatar jerked violently as if it was being torn apart by invisible hands. He fought to hold his ground, to keep himself from disintegrating into the chaos. But it was getting harder. Every line of code, every particle of the world around him, was unraveling. He knew there was no going back. The only way out of this was through it. Stop, Elliot said, his voice trembling. I created you. I can stop you. The creature paused, its shape flickering and convulsing, as if it were considering his words. Then, in an instant, the glitching monstrosity was upon him again, a blast of digital energy sending Elliot flying backward through the air. He crashed to the ground, his avatar disintegrating into fractured bits of code. He was on the edge of total collapse, his avatar's integrity failing, but even as the world around him collapsed, even as the virus surged forward, Elliot refused to give in. He couldn't. He had spent too long creating this world, building it piece by piece, only to have it destroyed by his own imperfections. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to focus. His mind worked faster than it ever had before, combing through the layers of code that made up his world. He had designed EchoNet from the ground up, he understood its architecture. He had built it, after all. And if he could create something as complex and beautiful as EchoNet, then he could tear down whatever was causing this, whatever corrupted this world. He had to find the root of the virus, the point where everything had gone wrong. He reached out, tapping into the deepest parts of the system, accessing the raw, unfiltered code that governed EchoNet. His fingers flew across the keyboard, each line of code reflecting his thoughts. He dove deeper, farther into the system, pulling at the very fabric of the virtual world, searching for the broken piece. His mind raced as the world around him began to glitch uncontrollably. He felt the pull of the virus, the growing darkness, but he fought it. This was his creation, and he was going to fix it. It wasn't until he reached the old server, the one where his consciousness had first been uploaded, that he understood. The virus, the corruption, the very thing tearing apart EchoNet, was his own fault. The traces of his initial upload had left behind fragments of himself, fragments of his fears, his doubts, his darker instincts. They had festered, turning into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. They had become the virus. A digital reflection of his own broken pieces, and now it was too late. The virus had grown too powerful to simply delete. There was no patching this up, no quick fix. He would have to confront it, head-on, in its purest form. Elliot closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. With everything he had left, he willed himself to face the creature. To confront the virus, not as an external force, but as a part of himself. He had to embrace his flaws, his doubts, and his fears. He had to let them go. "I am not perfect," Elliot whispered, his voice breaking through the static. "I am not perfect, and that's okay." As the words left his lips, the creature faltered. The glitching mass began to unravel, dissolving into the air like a cloud of data breaking apart. The world around him stilled, the storm of chaos slowly fading away. Elliot felt the pressure lift from his chest, the tension in his mind dissipating. The virus, no longer able to survive without his fear and denial, disintegrated into nothingness. Elliot stood alone in the quiet aftermath, his avatar fully intact, his digital self finally at peace. EchoNet, too, was beginning to rebuild. The trees grew back, the city's skyline shimmered in the distance. It would take time to restore the damage, but for the first time since the disaster began, Elliot felt a sense of hope. He had done it. He had saved his world. He had saved himself, and in doing so, he had come to understand something more profound. The digital world he had created was not separate from him. It was a part of him. And to fix it, he had to first fix himself. Elliot took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. The chaos that had once ruled the world around him now seemed like a distant memory. The world was still, almost serene in its newfound calm. EchoNet had been saved. But more importantly, Elliot had faced the heart of the virus, and in doing so, he had confronted the parts of himself that had been buried for so long. He felt the ripples of the change within him. The landscape, though slowly mending, still bore the scars of the battle. Some areas were untouched, pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. But in others, the damage was evident, remnants of the virus' destructive path still lingering in the form of corrupted files, half-formed structures, and areas where the code still flickered. The beauty of EchoNet, once untouched and perfect, was now marked by imperfection, yet there was something undeniably real about it. It was now truly his. Elliot's fingers hovered above the keyboard. He had repaired the immediate issues, but there was still much to be done. This wasn't just about cleaning up the mess. This was about making sure it didn't happen again, about ensuring that the virus, the part of him that had festered into chaos, wouldn't find a way back. It would take time, effort, and perhaps even a complete reworking of his vision for EchoNet. The utopia he had created was now an evolved world, built from the very same imperfections that had led to its near destruction. As Elliot thought about the road ahead, a new understanding dawned on him. He didn't have to hide from his flaws or deny them anymore. The virus, his own creation, wasn't something to be erased, it was something to be integrated. A piece of his psyche that he could now acknowledge. Maybe that was what EchoNet needed, too, not the pursuit of perfection, but the acceptance of its inherent flaws, and the ability to adapt. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of the city coming back to life. The avatars, once frozen in place by the virus, now stirred and moved. Some hesitated, confused by the sudden stillness and then the rebirth of the world around them, while others simply continued on, unaware of the catastrophe that had nearly consumed the entire system. Elliot slowly stood up from his chair, stretching as if waking from a long sleep. He needed to take a step back. The world was his, but for the first time, he didn't feel the overwhelming pressure to control it, to perfect it. He had created something beautiful and broken, just like himself. He walked through the city, his avatar now at peace, every step more grounded than before. The virtual buildings rose in front of him, once again whole, their glass surfaces shimmering under the sunlight that had just begun to break through the pixelated sky. He had designed each structure, every street corner, every tree, but now he noticed the flaws in them. The cracks in the architecture, the slight imperfections in the textures, the unusual angles where the code didn't quite match up with the real world. And yet, there was beauty in it. The world had a soul now, shaped by both its brilliance and its errors. The people, well, avatars, really, began to filter back into the streets. Their faces were expressions of both confusion and wonder as they tried to process the changes, both in their environment and, likely, within themselves. Elliot could feel their energy, an electricity in the air that was different than before. There was a new level of depth to EchoNet now. The NPCs were more responsive, more aware. Some even paused to look up at him as he walked by, their eyes no longer blank, but reflecting something deeper. Elliot couldn't help but smile, a quiet understanding blooming inside him. The people, the world, the code, it was all an extension of him, but it was also something more. He didn't need to dominate the world he had created. He only needed to let it be. Let it live, breathe, and grow on its own. As he continued walking, an avatar approached him. This one was a little different, an NPC that looked strangely familiar. Elliot paused, his heart skipping a beat. The character was dressed in a flowing digital robe, their face a blur of glitching fragments, but there was something unmistakable about the way they moved. There was a sense of recognition that made Elliot's stomach tighten. The NPC stopped in front of him, standing still for a moment, as if considering whether or not to speak. When it did, its voice was distorted, but the words were clear. Elliot, it said, its voice echoing with something that felt unsettlingly human. You fixed it. But the question is, did you fix yourself? Elliot felt his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, he could only stare at the glitching figure before him. His mind raced. Had the virus left its traces behind in other forms? Was this NPC some kind of remnant, a physical manifestation of the parts of him he had tried to erase? The question was too loaded, too personal. And yet, there it was. A mirror held up before him, demanding an answer. I'm not perfect, Elliot replied slowly, his voice steadier than he felt. But I'm okay with that. The NPC's face flickered for a moment, as though processing the answer. Then, it gave a small nod, and the glitching softened, the distortion fading away. The figure smiled, a subtle expression that reminded Elliot of the AI assistant he had built to guide new users through the system, though this one was different. This one felt real. You've learned, it said simply, before stepping aside and fading into the background, as if it had never been there at all. Elliot stood there for a long moment, the words of the NPC lingering in the air like a whisper. He had fixed EchoNet, yes, but in doing so, he had fixed himself. The two were inextricably linked, and there was no separating them. He couldn't keep trying to erase the imperfections of the world, nor could he erase the imperfections within himself. They were part of the same thing. And that was okay. As the days passed, Elliot worked to restore EchoNet. He didn't rush. He didn't force things. He allowed the world to heal at its own pace, just as he was learning to heal. The virus had left its mark, yes, but it had also left something else. It had left a space for growth, for evolution. The world of EchoNet would never be the same, and neither would Elliot. But that was the point. The world was alive, imperfect, unpredictable, and beautiful in its own unique way. He would be there, of course, to guide it, to nurture it, but he didn't have to control it. The lesson was clear now: let go. Let the world be what it was meant to be. Let the people, the avatars, the code evolve in ways he couldn't foresee. And in return, maybe he could evolve, too. The virtual horizon stretched out before him, an ever-changing landscape of possibility. And for the first time, Elliot was at peace with the unknown. He wasn't just a creator, he was a part of this world. And it was okay. As the sun set over the rebuilt city, Elliot took one final look at the world he had made and let out a long breath. It was beautiful. It was his. And it was imperfect. But that was enough.